Okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Toyin Atolagbe. I serve Great Hearts Crystals as Executive Director, and I will be introducing Anika Prather this evening. She will be leading us in a conversation about the revolution of the Great Conversation. It's such an honor to do that today. I met Anika Prather about 3 years ago, I think. This was just during COVID and right after the George Floyd death and incident and uproar and the unsettling issues that we had in the country. And it was such a blessing to have her come into our lives as Great Hearts, because she helped us shape the conversation around what was going on. She helped us with the E Pluribus Unum curriculum that we used to educate our teachers about the kinds of conversations that they could have in the classroom as the students were coming back into the classroom. One of the things that I'm mostly grateful to Anika for is that she is a voice of reason and voice of purpose. She's a woman of peaceful intent. She loves the Lord with all her heart, and she's very, very passionate about classical education. I refer to her as mighty woman of valor. I will give us a little bio of Anika Prather. She's the founder of the Living Water School and co-author of the Black Intellectual Tradition. If you haven't bought that book yet, I definitely recommend it. And I think she will have some for sale tomorrow. She's a sought-after speaker on racial healing and classical education. Anika is a family woman. She's married to Damon Prather, and they have 3 children. And she resides in Maryland. Please join me in welcoming Anika Prather. Today's event is sponsored by the University of Dallas at St. Ambrose Center. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. The name of this talk is called The Revolution of the Great Conversation. It's a revolution because most people don't want to do it. And I want to talk to you about that, and I want to talk to you about being a revolutionary, about pushing forward to have the conversation. And you'll also get to find out what is the conversation. And it's not as complex as you think it is. I was so moved by some of the speakers I've heard already. I can't remember everybody's name, but the gentleman last night who talked about story, is how it's the song of the divine. And that really resonates with me. It's something I've always felt. My husband, he's one of those weird engineers who's also a creative. I don't know if anyone can identify with that. So there's this one side, because I'm only a creative. I don't have any engineering capacity at all. So he has this engineering side that's pretty rigid, and then he has this creative side, but he's a creative writer. He writes poetry and stories, and sometimes he leads a writer's workshop. And one session, he talked about how God always speaks to us in story. And this is not going to be a religious talk. I will talk a little bit about my faith because it is who I am, and I'm unable to hide it and water it down. So I always like to give a disclaimer that if I'm talking about my faith, it doesn't mean you have to share the same one. But it is who I am, and I can only be who I am. And so this notion of story that we heard last night really resonated with me, that it really is a part of how we talk to one another, sharing our stories. So, as you know, I love to sing. And as I was preparing this talk, this one tiny little line from an old hymn that I'm not going to finish the whole hymn, just really kind of came to the forefront. And it said, "This is my story. This is my song." Why did that person put that in the hymn? This is my story. This is my song. When I think about it, I think of my ancestors who told their story through songs like "Go Down, Moses, Way Down in Egypt land, Tell, O Pharaoh, let my people go." Or when they sang songs like "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home." These were their stories. They couldn't read. They couldn't write, but they could sing. And somehow through their pain, they heard God's story in the midst of their pain and decided to have a conversation with God's story with their own story. So these Negro spirituals talk about the Bible, but they talk about their pain. And it was their only way of revolution. It was their way of having a revolutionary conversation with the one who didn't want to set them free. So as they were out in the fields and as the master didn't want them to speak, but for some reason he loved to hear them sing, "Help me, Lord." So even though he silenced them, they could sing. They could sing about wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. That's a conversation about baptism, or is it a conversation about, I gotta get away from you, and the way I'm gonna escape is going to the water so the hunting dogs can't smell me? It was a conversation. It was a conversation with the gospel and a conversation with the master that I want to be free. Why is it that no matter who you are or where you're from, you want to talk? Riot is the voice of the unheard. That means we all want to have a conversation. Now, I have a lot to say to you today, and I'm praying, God, help me how to sew this all together, because this is so important. We're all here at this classical education conference, and we're talking about Socratic dialogues. We're talking about what is a great book, how it tells the human story and invites us to have a conversation with it. And we all may have this head knowledge, but do we really understand how much conversation is a part of our very instinct? It's a part of our very DNA. And when we don't have a conversation, we give birth to pain. When you don't allow conversation, you give birth to pain. So, when I say, "This is my story, this is my song," every people group has a story. And have you noticed that every people group has a song? The story, maybe through oral tradition, written tradition, is told over and over and over, right? The gentleman who spoke last night talked about how the Iliad, things like the Iliad, weren't supposed to really be written. They were stories shared around the fire that made it onto the page, and we share it today and we discuss it today because we all want to tell a story. I did a little research as I prepared for this, looking at story. There are so many origin stories. I love teaching origin stories. Like when you talk about, there's some Native American origin stories that talked about where woman came from. It sounds so much like the story of Adam and Eve, but I digress. There are West African stories about how certain animals got certain colors or were created or made to be what they are. There are Asian stories. There are African American stories. There are American stories. We have songs that match these stories. The story of the Revolution is matched with, "Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light?" And then there's another song that matches it that makes a little people think we're trying to replace one. No one's trying to replace anything. And there's another one that's also an anthem that tells a story of how another people group came to feel like America. And it's okay, right? And so why do we do this? Why do people groups make up stories and songs that tell their story? So we know there are a lot of origin stories of how people were created. I want to give honor to that so no one thinks I'm indoctrinating. But because of my framework, I'm going to talk to you about a story I feel explains to me. Now, you can take this as myth and just say, "Oh, that's lovely." Or if you're with me, you can say, "Yes, amen, sister." But let me just tell you my story, because this is my story. When I read the story of God, and let's say that he actually created us to talk. Think about it. In the beginning was the Word. What did he do to even make the world? He spoke. Speaking is part of our DNA. When he breathed into mankind the breath of life, he gave them a desire to talk, to speak. And we see what happened at Babel. This is, again, you can think this is myth, but this is my origin story, and I hope you can honor it. It's okay. And when we think about Babel, when they were having conversation together. Now, this story is deep, even if it's not true. It's a really deep story. Because at Babel, they all spoke the same language. They all had the same human experience. And because they had this common language, they became so powerful that even God had to say, wait a minute now. They're speaking the same language. They're going to really mess things up if I keep letting them build this tower. They're starting to become almost too powerful. They're forgetting me. And so he didn't destroy anyone. He just caused them to speak different languages. So they couldn't accomplish anything. Now, a lot of people don't realize that's a cautionary tale, but it's also a sign of what we could do if we just talk to one another. You don't have to believe the story, because if you read about Zeus, you can handle this. I read that differently as I prepared. You read it, you say, oh, that's so terrible. They got so powerful, and he scrambled the languages, and they all went to different places in the earth. But the very creator had to scramble their languages so they couldn't work together to do something big. That tells me that we actually desire to be together. Us being disconnected by race, by different human experiences, by socioeconomic status, religion, belief systems, human experiences, us disconnecting ourselves like that from such superficial things is not natural. We are drawn to one another. That's why we argue so much. We argue so much. It's another way of having a conversation. You should be like me so we can be friends. Because it's not natural. Like for me, I don't argue about, is there a Santa Claus? I don't say, we argue about us not agreeing with one another because we really want to like each other. And if we could all just agree on the same things and look the same way and say the same thing and have the same experiences and vote the same way, but I digress, then we could all just get along. But what if it's okay that our conversations are different? What if we can still be together even if we're different? And what if conversation, something as simple as just talking to one another with a heart of grace, a heart of love, a heart of humility, could change everything? The conversation. Again, my story could be somebody else's myth. I think about when Adam and Eve were created. It says that the Creator came down in the evenings to what? Talk to them. Conversation. We actually, as human beings, tend to do things that facilitate conversation. We have to talk about everything. We have to engage and share things back and forth. We do it so naturally. It's why we tell stories. We don't tell stories to entertain ourselves. We sit around and tell stories to entertain one another, to inform one another. It's our way of communicating. It says when Christ came, he talked mainly through story. He communicated his point through story. Why? Because it's natural. And him teaching. Have you noticed how Jesus taught? I'm getting somewhere with this. I hope you're following me. Have you noticed how Jesus taught? And how he got so irritated when the Pharisees were indoctrinating instead of having a conversation? Judging instead of listening? Everything was a question. Everything was, so what do you think? Nicodemus could say, well, Jesus, am I supposed to crawl back in my mother's stomach? Or I don't understand this born again thing. It was a conversation. Because if Jesus felt that we need to talk to one another, it's why everyone was drawn to him. To tax collectors and sinners, Pharisees, the rich, the poor, the demon-possessed, the leper. Everyone was drawn to Jesus because he was doing something that was natural, that they yearned for, that they wanted. And it was a conversation. They had something to say. This is my story. This is my song. We all have a story. We all have a song to sing. It's natural. And when we don't do it ourselves, when we don't let others do it, when we don't let our students do it, we're hindering something that is natural, that we were created to do. We were created to talk. We're not parrots. Have you seen this video of this parrot singing September? It is the most hilarious thing. He doesn't even know what he's singing, but he's just in the cage whistling the song September. That's not us. We have logic. We have understanding. We think. And we have human experiences that get birthed into our soul that we just want to tell somebody. And then sometimes we try to tell someone and they don't like it. It doesn't quite have the narrative we want to hear. So we shut it off and we end a possible friendship, a possible relationship. The revolution of the conversation is bathed in story. And it's so natural for us. I know the founding fathers were not thinking this deep about it, but they created the whole nation to have a conversation. Process that for a minute. They just did it naturally. To start the country, they actually did it around a conversation. The 1776, they were there just talking and arguing, sitting around. Like sometimes people think the founding fathers were a bunch of beer buddies that just kind of walked up to a bar and said, man, let's just start a country. Half of them didn't even like each other. I think John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died on the same day, but competing with who's going to die first. But even still, with all of their differences, some wanted slaves, some didn't want slaves. Some wanted one kind of government, others wanted a different kind of government. Then, a lot of people don't know the Native American people, the Iroquois Nation was in that conversation. Benjamin Franklin said, hey, I think the Iroquois Nation has something we can use to help us write this Constitution. Let's invite them to the conversation. That was revolutionary. And those leaders of the Iroquois Nation sat there at the Continental Congress, part of the conversation that birthed our nation. What amazing things happen out of conversation. Do you know why conversation is so magical? Because we were made to do it. And when we don't do it, we can't get anything done. Let me give you some examples of conversations that did amazing things. And at the end of this talk, I'm hoping you are like, we're going to have some conversations. So if I go back to the nation, it's not a monarchy. And we all think we understand what a democracy is. It's for the people, by the people, yeah. We get that. But think about how Congress works. Why do we have two sides of Congress? We will sit there, my father watches CNN all day long. It drives my mother absolutely insane. Oh Lord, if he sits up in front of that TV one more time. But he watches, and we watch the news and we hear about, and the Senate said, and the House of Representatives said, and the bill is stuck. But before long, they keep having that conversation, and before long, we have a law that keeps us safe. For hundreds of years, we have been run through conversation. Even when you think, oh, they'll never pass this law, oh, they just hate us all. But sure enough, a conversation happens, a compromise is reached, and we progress forward. The whole country was naturally made. They sat around and said, you know what? This is only going to work if we talk. Why? They came to the New World. Yes, there were people here. I'm not ignoring that. But they came to the New World. They started a country, and they knew it had to be different from where they came from. This place that wouldn't let them worship the way they wanted to, that wouldn't let them speak about the things that were important to them, that they were oppressed. So they created a country where we could talk. And not just, and then what is Congress made up of? Representatives of people that live in your city, your town, your state, that find out what you want, so your voice is heard, then they take it up to DC where I live, hey. And they have a what? Hey, you following me? Yes, they have a conversation, and we feel relatively safe, seen, heard. Here's another example of how conversations do amazing things. Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Banneker. Now, Thomas Jefferson was a brilliant man, but he had some views about black people that were really hurtful. If you read notes on the state of Virginia, you'll hear different things he said about our inferiority, that we smell bad, that we're dumb, that we have no common sense, that we're only useful to be farm usage. But Benjamin Banneker was a black man. He was a scientist, a mathematician. He even wrote an almanac. He helped design parts of our nation. And he wrote Thomas Jefferson a letter. Why? Why did this black man feel like he had to write Thomas Jefferson a letter? Like, why did it even matter? Why couldn't he just move on with his life? Because he needed to have a conversation. And he wrote Thomas Jefferson a letter. And he said, I think you misunderstand who we are. This is what I can do, and I'm a black man. Do you know Thomas Jefferson wrote him back? And he was surprised. Wow, I've never met a black man that was smart before. Help me, Jesus. And they had a conversation. And Thomas Jefferson, we don't know where his heart was, where his mind was when he died. But he did say, towards the end of his life, I shudder to think what God will say to me when I stand before him. I wonder if that thought came to him as he began to have engagement and conversation with those who didn't look like him. Something was kind of being birthed inside of him. We don't know where that was going to go. We don't know what happened with that. Another example of a conversation. Phyllis Wheatley, taken from West Africa, 7 years old, put on a slave ship, not Carnival Cruise Line. 7 years old, by herself, chained up at the bottom of a slave ship with no parent or anyone to protect her. Something traumatic happened to that little girl, so traumatic that it wiped her memory. But it didn't take her ability to have a conversation because it's natural. So she gets here, 7 years old. She doesn't know the language, but she's intrigued. John Wheatley sees this beautiful little girl, feels sorry for her, purchases her, and he and his wife treat her like their daughter. They homeschool her classically. In 18 months, she learns English, Greek, and Latin. Why? Because she wanted to be part of the conversation. The whole reason black people have loved classical education is because it equipped them to be part of the conversation. They were coming from a different country. There were things they didn't understand, but they got a hold of this classical education, and before long they're saying, oh, this is what this means, and this is how I can be a part. And eventually Phyllis Wheatley gets older. She's writing beautiful poetry, and she writes a poem. It's a conversation to George Washington. You've heard the story. Telling him he's like Zeus as he leads the revolution. She would write letters saying, as you all fight for freedom, remember me. That was her story. That was her song. And George Washington wrote her back and said, because they now speak the same language, they both have been educated classically. She writes him this poem littered with references to Greek mythology, naming him as a god, and he writes her back and says, you have been gifted by the muses. They were having a conversation. A lot of people think classical education, when black people like classical education, it's because they're trying to be something that they're not. I've met some of those who feel that way, but we're not talking about those today. Most of my ancestors and most of those I know who value this type of education love it because it allows us to have a conversation with those we used to be disconnected with. We naturally do not want to feel this disconnection. We naturally, no matter what anyone tells you, buried beneath all the bitterness and anger and frustration over racism a person of color may have, at the very root of it is a desire for relationship. And so we gravitated to classical education because it gave us this language, this literacy, that we could participate in the great conversation. Martin Luther King is another example. You know the story, letter from a Birmingham jail. We hear that story, and even though it says, letter from a Birmingham jail, how many of you all imagine him in a library writing that letter? You know it's you. Well, maybe it's just me. But then I was like, no, he was in jail. No paper, no pen, just the memory of the great conversation. Because he writes that letter because some white ministers had written an op-ed saying he was disrupting the peace. He wasn't a man of God because he's not respecting authority, that he should accept the place he has in society and let it run its course in its time. And instead of being angry, he chose to have a what? Conversation. And he sat in that jail, he read it, Somebody had given him the newspaper. And on the newspaper, he began to write letter from a Birmingham jail. Someone had smuggled in a pen for him, and he began to write letter from a Birmingham jail. And one of the things he says is, I'm just really, just so calmly, I'm like, this man was a man of God. So calmly says, I'm just amazed that you're arguing with me for doing these peaceful protests about injustice, but you're not upset about injustice. Just a question, conversation. And then in response to them, he tells them a conversation he had with Plato, Socrates. And he tells them, this is my own dramatization of what he said. He said, I was talking to my boy Socrates the other day, and he told me that I should keep being a nonviolent gadfly. That's one of my favorite parts of that letter. I will keep sitting at these lunch counters. I will keep kneeling in the center of the city until I get on your nerves so much you stop Jim Crow. All through a conversation. And Martin Luther King, if you watch his speeches, he only uses conversation. His whole training was nonviolence, but conversation, because it's natural. And he had this conversation, and his conversation was so powerful that it ended Jim Crow, that it brought us the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that made it so he was even able to live long enough to take his children to an amusement park. The power of conversation is powerful. It is magical because it's natural. We have a story. We have a song. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. That's a song for all of us. It's a conversation through song. It tells a story of struggle, but faith. And he lived just long enough to see how his conversation made a difference. I have one more story. I love stories. Frederick Douglass. We can't forget, I call him my boyfriend. Have you seen him? Freddie was fine. My husband said I could have dead boyfriends as long as he can have dead girlfriends. So his girlfriend is Madame Curie, whatever. But I will say this, and I'll end with Frederick Douglass. He felt trapped. 12-year-old boy, right? Martin Luther King says, a riot is the voice of the unheard. He felt his rage growing at 12 because he wasn't allowed to have the conversation. Everything that was unnatural was happening to him. And he felt like he was going to burst. And he found the Western canon. That's just history. I'm not making this up. That's just history. And he began to read the works of Cicero and Plato and Aristotle. And as an enslaved man, boy, teenager, he began to have conversations with them. He would invite the other enslaved people to come listen to him talk about these works. He would teach them how to have conversation with these authors. When he escaped to freedom, instead of going and just living happily ever after in Canada, he stayed in America to make a difference through conversation. And he didn't decide to join John Brown. Some people get frustrated about that. He didn't do that. He didn't turn to violence. He only used conversation. He became a speaker, an orator, because it was natural. And his oration and his speaking was so powerful and so strong that he got the attention of Abraham Lincoln. And they began to have a what? All together now? Conversation. And that conversation led to the Emancipation Proclamation. Are you seeing what I'm saying to you? Are you seeing the power of conversation? And they won the Civil War. And the enslaved people were free. And Abraham Lincoln, for the few months that he was alive, the little bit of time he was alive, he understood for us to truly be a nation, we must create schools that teach the next generation to have conversation. So the Freedmen's Bureau was an organization Abraham Lincoln created. And it was created to help the enslaved people have medical treatment, to get land, to get jobs, to get money, whatever they needed to find their way here in America as now free citizens. And these schools, every single one of them was classical. Most HBCUs have conversation. In those early years of American education that included now Black people, we started becoming part of Congress. You can look it up. Right after, during Reconstruction, we were being elected officials. We were becoming a part of the great conversation, and we were becoming a part of the work of making this country great. And then he was murdered. And that work ended. And slowly schools began to stop teaching all children how to have a conversation. And instead, they became segregated. Jim Crow came, and we've been separated, and we've been trying to get back to that place of walking in what is natural to us, to have this conversation. We need to go back to that. That's why we're here. Even though the world looks at us like we are insane, I know they do for me. We know the history of our country is rooted in conversation. It is a world story. It's in our DNA. It's revolution these days times, right? We're living like separated times. This conversation changed everything. So I have two things to ask you to do. You committed to have a conversation. Not just make you feel comfortable. Everyone. Instead of getting offended, listen, ask, tell them. That's the first. Circle if we where we are. We may not change the world, but you can change your neighborhood. Maybe your family, change your friends. Have these conversations. Reach out to those different. Walk in what's natural. Have the conversation. That's number one. Number two, if you're an educator, create a class, a school, a space that teaches the next generation to do the same. To be humble, to have hearts of grace, to listen, to feel free to talk. Teach them. Bring in those Socratic dialogues. Teach them. When you see them not allowing others to talk, teach them, no. We're supposed to talk. We're supposed to be different. And it's okay. And I promise you, if you do that, you will start a revolution. Thank you.
Wow. That was so powerful. Wow, that was so powerful. I was in the back just laughing, singing along. I love singing too. I think my students' greatest memories of me would be me singing in the classroom. I literally just sing everywhere, in the hallways, in the bathroom. So I agree with you, stories. And I guess the situation in education currently is seems to me that seeking children out in the classroom is something that would be much easier in the classroom with fewer students. And I say that because I've been a public partner for about 12 years. Finally, this year, I moved to private education. And in our classroom, the most we had in a classroom was 16. And what I have noticed is that teachers in the classroom, small class, tend to engage all students in the classroom more. They tend to encourage them to use their voice more. Because really listening to you, in my mind, I'm like, teacher, students, 32 students in their classroom, how do you reach that? What word of encouragement do you give teachers that grapple with the reality of running classrooms with 30 to 32 students? Because the goal is to help them find their voices so that they can engage in the great conversation. What's your encouragement for teachers?
I think, first of all, you have to be committed that this has to happen. Let me just say that this is so important. I went through this historical explanation of being able to have the conversation, having story, being able to sing your song, because when we don't allow people to do that, it creates a mess. And if we don't do that in our schools, in our classrooms, we will always have a mess. A lot of times if you go to schools that have a lot of behavioral challenges, I've worked in schools like that, it's because there's no space for people to tell their story and have conversation. They are frustrated. As like I said, Martin Luther King said, a riot is the voice of the unheard. He's not justifying riots. He's just saying, though, when there's anger, Frederick Douglass really expressed it. I didn't feel I was going to be a slave forever, and I had nowhere to express this frustration until he was able to have a conversation with ancient literature. He needed to have that conversation. He began to practice oration. It saved him. So first of all, understand this is not optional. If you don't facilitate conversation, you're hurting children. I just want to drive this home. Even if you're a school that has a very low number of people of color, and those children of color cannot tell their story or feel part of the conversation, you're hurting them. Doesn't matter if you don't like how their parents voted or what some of their beliefs may be. If they can't talk about their human experience and why they believe what they believe, and that doesn't mean you can't share too, but they have to be able to talk, you are hurting them. You are offending them. So, I just hope you really can process that. The second thing is, if you come to a place of understanding how critical this is for every student, then next you need to come up with strategies for how do I bring this into a classroom of 32 students. I'm going to give you some suggestions.
Of course.
You can create, and I've done this before, you can create small discussion groups. It doesn't have to be all day. It doesn't have to be every day. It has to be at some point in the month, at least, where there's that release. So you can take your group of students, create small discussion groups. Each discussion group meets with you once a week or somehow, however you want to schedule it, but they have a time in the month, that small group, where they come and they have that conversation or that Socratic dialogue around literature. Because another part of this, too, is I'm not just talking about sitting around talking about what shoes you bought yesterday. What is the content of the conversation? I needed to qualify that, too. One thing about ancient literature, even faith-based literature or character-based literature that really evokes a healthy conversation, is it gives you something meaningful to discuss. So that's the other piece. So I would break up your large classes and create a schedule that you're rotating through the year, meeting with each group to engage in this conversation. And I'm going to tell you, it's so powerful, even if you're not doing it every day. Just that little, I call it pockets of classical education. Like if you're not in a classical school, but maybe you're a public school teacher, or maybe you're at a school that doesn't really value classical education, you can find these pockets, and here are your pockets. You can choose a recess time once a month. If you don't mind giving up your planning period, that's a sacrifice, I know. Also, the week before break, most principals are like, I can't wait till this thing is over. You have those few days before. I used to do that when I taught in a school that wasn't classical. I would use the week before the break to do something classical. I'm not kidding. Those kids, it was a kindergarten class. By the time the school year ended, just by me having those pockets, they were on second grade level and everything. Just that little bit. So, I mean, imagine if they got it all the time, but just a little bit. I always say, if you could just touch the hem of the classical education's garment. Did you get it? There's power in it. It's magical because it's rooted in conversation. We're supposed to talk. So the canon are authors having conversation with one another. They're writing, but they're talking about their human experience. It's so magical because it's who we are. So any little bit you give to your students, but be intentional. Okay, you don't have all the time. You have a lot of students. Look at your schedule and say, when can I create a pocket of time to just sprinkle some of this goodness on my babies? It will change their life.
That's powerful. I liked that you said not having those conversations is not an option. That kind of sank in for a while. Okay, we'll open it up for questions. We have a microphone right in the middle.
Queen.
Oh.
Is I too was born in Washington, D.C. Education taught me to love. That's how I was raised. My mama in school.
Yeah.
In a classical school that value what we learned and comedy look wise, but I'm as high as 7 as you can imagine. And I went. And we were talking about what we do liberates.
Yes.
Mind.
Yes.
I felt proud.
Yes.
And for you, administrator, someone who has been a teacher, has taught a child. I had a family come to me. They were upset because we don't celebrate Black History Month. I did my due diligence and I double-checked. Went through all of, what we have available. And I responded with, the reason we don't single out is because of the law. It isn't quite good enough. I understood. How do we respond and continue that conversation?
I'm in my house, I said Black History Month. I know it's a little bit controversial, but I don't hear me. My school does not celebrate Black History Month either. And that was a decision, Asian students, white students, all Latino, all students, right? And we were at a meeting with the students here, and they felt that it wasn't fair. History Month, African American History Month, Asian American, I think Asia Pacific, I think it's all types of Jewish Heritage Month. So we plan a calendar, which is a cultural calendar, that outlines each month that is connected to a certain heritage. And at least one point in the year, we have to do something to honor the heritage of that month. So it's fair. But we do it lightly because classical curriculum is intense, so we don't have a lot of time.
Amen.
So we're intentional about creating this sense of everyone is important. And then, so that's the other thing. That's one thing we do. So it's like, we send out the calendar. We'll say, hey, it's Jewish Heritage Month. It's Ramadan next week. teach them about that culture, and it's just really quick, touch on it. Then in March, outside of most of the heritage months besides Women's History Month, at the beginning of March, we have something called the Heritage Festival. And the rule is you must do your project on someone that is connected to your heritage. So go and find out your heritage, and it's really a lot trickier than people realize. So when students did this research, we had some find out that they were related to some pope. The child was just as chocolate as I was. So he did his project on the Pope. We've had students say, I'm part Blackfeet Indian. So they did their project on the Blackfeet Indian. And then of course we had students do it on African American history. We had one student do it on the girl who used to play Blossom, because she's also an activist for Jewish heritage. And he did his project on her. It was very informative. And we also had students do it on the Black Panther. And they work on this for several months. And then we turn the school building into a museum. And we invite the parents and community. The kids dress up. They have displays and technology. And when you come, you just walk through, and each room is dedicated to a certain set of displays. It's just one night in the whole year. And they each get, it's the most, I've been doing it now for 10 years at the school. And it just that, doing those two things helps people understand, because this is also a teaching moment, and you may feel uncomfortable. This is really important. I'm sorry I'm going on, but you may feel uncomfortable as a white woman saying this to a black woman. But we do have to speak truth in love.
Amen.
That we cannot center ourselves. We have to listen to one another, but you got to put human beings at the center, not one ethnicity. And the reason why I feel really strongly about this is because when I was working at Johns Hopkins, I did a lot of research on this similar topic. And in an effort to deal with, this all kind of happened after George Floyd, in an effort for schools to address racism, they began to change curriculum, which I valued. I thought that was important. I was really excited to see more representation. But as I began to research schools literally across the nation, most of the schools, the way that the change they made was they only taught Black history. So when I would ask, well, do you have Latino kids in your school? Yeah, we have about 50% of our population is Latino. Okay. I can't believe I'm saying this as a Black woman, because I thought I would never see the day where I'm only saying, you teaching Black history too much. It's just funny to me, because I wanted to, I grew up in a school where I couldn't have Black history taught. We weren't allowed to learn it. For me to even be saying, you're forgetting somebody. But that's where we are. We've kind of tipped to the other side. So it's really a time to, if you say it, hey, we got to think about everybody, and don't celebrate everybody, then that's a problem. So you got to be intentional about saying, you're right. Thank you so much for bringing this to my attention. We're going to be intentional about celebrating Black history and everyone's history in this school, so everyone feels seen. Would you mind giving me some ideas on what we can do to celebrate Black history? And I'll talk to some of the other parents from other ethnicities to see how we can celebrate their heritage. And maybe we can do this event, or maybe we can do these things once a month and do it like that. Maybe create a team of parents and volunteers. Hey, we want to incorporate us celebrating the diversity that's in this school. And I think if they feel a part of that, they won't feel like you're rejecting the teaching of Black history. It's very hard. I understand. It's so hard because everyone's very tense right now. But if you do it right and are very intentional and very sincere, I think you'll be fine.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have just about 3 minutes to go. I'll try and take the 3 people we have out here. But Anika, you have to be really short.
Super quick. I've found in my short tenure, just a couple of years, that my students are rock stars when it comes to having these difficult conversations. Anything I throw at them, whether that's racism, sexism, oppression, they're fine discussing it. I have had multiple faculty members who are upset with what I'm talking about in my classes, and they refuse to talk to me about what is going on, whether how to reconcile these issues, the other half engage in that conversation.
Have you gone to the get together and talk about? Yeah.
And our also tried to get involved in a conversation, and it's not happened once, it's happened multiple times.
I know I'm asking this question over. It's that have conversations.
They just want to stop talking about it. They want to take things out of material.
You going to only because, yeah, that's. I want to encourage you to keep for race, but I'm actually just a you to find love to keep asking to talk about it. What we need to do. And the reason why people are really they don't have these conversations, and to that they're really silent something they're and just got to see what may not be satisfied, but you serve the students. So I feel strongly about this because I have people anger towards me for classical education to direct relations. Friendship that I had as what my purpose was. Be focused on that and leave everything to God.
You.
It's been about in the conversation we put out, and we live in an incredibly centered society. I would like to hear the side of the conversation, to listen attentively with empathy and maybe even teach that.
Yeah.
How we go about doing it.
Yes. It's hard when you have human experiences, really think are more intense experience. I mean, the thing is humility. It's got humility, and I experience there I'm getting where I have one who's listening and like talk about, and I do a lot of talk about as I've gone. I feel this someone, and he will tell me why they read their story was interesting. They were a student who went to black school, and they were treated terribly. And not that person, but gymnastics, I had to give my soul to feel empathy. Just be honest. I don't see me. I'm going that one little about 2 I go had to was genuinely hurt, and I had my own self. I had to say, you know, I'm happy, but I would treat you that. Causes amazing conversation, and the there went down. Some people who are listening, happy. How do you always want to? I'm not trying to. I do demand love. This is my song. When I say my creator, I love. I love us. Love the way he did for me. Did he do that? And that's all I can do. But love, you do up space for to be shared. It's become.
Forgive me,
Okay.
2 questions. Can you recommend the best biography of Leslie?
Oh God. I not remember. Afterwards I can up my phone and get.
Is there a way to
If you go to .com, I have a link where on there. It's on my about section. That link music.
Oh, I'm very happy to hear that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Thank you, Dr. Anika Prather, for your time and wisdom this evening. We truly appreciate your love for classical education and all of us, actually. Thank you all for your time today. I hope you enjoyed the symposium today. We look forward to seeing you in the morning at 8:30. Thank you. Have a good night.